Attorney knows best. Intelligent interviews. Interesting insight. Intriguing information. Attorney knows best. Here's your host, Sean Bartley.
Thank you for joining us today on attorneyknowsbest.com. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with and having a conversation with Attorney Navarra, esteemed, accomplished attorney and author and partner of the law firm Sapra and Navarra, located in Irvine, California. Thanks for joining us, Albert.
Thank you, Sean. Man, it's so good to hear your voice and see you after all these years.
Yeah. How's the weather in the OC? I'm here in the DC metro area, and you're in Orange County, California. How's the weather out there?
Yeah, 72 degrees, dry and sunny as usual. I mean, the only weather events that I've noticed in the last year is a lot of fires. You know, I mean, I need to grow up around here, and I just don't remember that many fires. But it seems like every month we got a fire here, and the sky is that funny orange color, and people are evacuating their homes and living in hotels. So, you know, that's not good. But
how are things in the OC? Is it like that in Orange County?
Yeah, we had a bunch of fires here just like a month ago, you know, and I'm lucky where we are. I'm right in the middle of the urban part of, you know, Irvine, where there's like nothing that can burn here. There's just a bunch of glass buildings. But Irvine's a big city, and there's a lot of brush and shrubs, and it's just a shame we have so many fires. I just don't remember so many fires, you know, 30 years ago when I was growing up.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, I think it's also drier out there, maybe. I don't know.
It is.
But yeah, it seems as though with the new construction and all the new building there'd be less fires because there's less growth and underbrush with all the new homes. But yeah, it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Albert, you're a successful lawyer in California. Why'd you decide to become a lawyer?
OJ Simpson.
Okay.
I was working as a technical writer, you know, writing software manuals and getting kind of bored with that, and watching the OJ trial. And I don't know if you remember, but there were a lot of oral arguments in the OJ trial, a lot of motions where the lawyers, you know, Cochran and Darden and Marcia Clark would argue to the judge outside the presence of the jury. And I just remember, you know, when you're listening to them, watching them, and, you know, when you're watching somebody, it's easy to criticize, right? And say, oh, right, you know, this lawyer didn't seem to know the facts as well as the other lawyer, or maybe that lawyer seemed to know the law better than the other lawyer. And so I would just kind of watch and kind of critique them and just imagine myself doing that, you know, I think I could do that. Maybe I could do it. Maybe I would like to even do it better, you know? I would like to be that lawyer that knows the facts more than anybody in that courtroom, knows the law more than anybody, including the judge, and can put it together, you know, can articulate it persuasively, you know, and just just knock it out, man.
So you didn't know you wanted to be a lawyer right away, like as a child or in college. It was after college, right? You went to Cal State Fullerton, and you were working as a technical writer.
Yeah. I was 30 years old.
Okay.
You know? And the only thing I can say is that was there from an early childhood was I always liked to listen to people discuss things and argue things and explain things.
Right.
I always had an ear for just dialogue and an ear for what didn't sound right to me. You know, like if somebody is making an argument and they don't seem to know the facts, or there's some fallacy they're making in their argument or whatever. I always had an ear for that, but never wanted to be a lawyer until the OJ trial, when I actually saw real lawyers doing it in court and thought, man.
Had you ever had any experience with lawyers or met a lawyer or really focused in on lawyering in a TV show?
Sean, I didn't even know a lawyer. I didn't even know. Yeah. Now, I should qualify one thing. Half my family lives in Italy, and they're all lawyers. But, you know, I was born and raised in LA. They're all in Italy. So I can't really count that, you know.
So you're like a real Italian. Your parents immigrated to the United States, and you're like a first generation American, right?
Yeah.
So you're a consigliere.
Yeah, and can I tell you something kind of weird? Okay, so I went to law school, right? About 1 year into law school, I got a little bored because it turns out that your first day in law school is pretty much the same as the last day in law school in that you just read cases,
Yeah.
right? You try to understand the case. You explain the case to the judge or to the professor. Maybe the professor asks you some questions about the case. Well, what if I change this fact in the case? How would that change the outcome? Or what if I change that fact? Would that change it? You have this Socratic dialogue with professors, but it's the same thing every day, every week, every month for 3 years, full time. The only thing that changes is the color of your case book. One semester it's a red case book because it's contracts. The next semester it's a blue case book because it's torts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I got bored. And I managed to, and so I wanted out of law. This is like after the first year of law school. I didn't want anything to do with law. I wanted out of the country. I was so fed up, and burnt out. And so I got my Italian passport, right? Because my mom was born and raised in Italy. And I went to Italy and I got a job lined up and I wanted to move there and live there. Something happened. It didn't click. I don't think I was prepared emotionally or financially.
Mm-hmm.
I had a little bit of student debt. So for various reasons, I came back to the States and got a job purely by accident in workers' compensation as a workers' compensation defense lawyer for Liberty Mutual Insurance Company, where you and I first met, right? Like 20 years ago.
20 years ago.
So that's how I got into the actual practice of law, right? I mean, OJ is the reason why I went to law school, but why did I end up practicing a lawyer? I don't know. I just wasn't ready.
So you graduated law school and then went to Italy and then came back.
Yeah, graduated from law school, passed the bar, went to Italy, came back, got a job doing workers' comp defense, and been doing it ever since now.
Right. Let's talk about law school. You went to a law school, a local small law school in California that prepares you to be a practitioner from day one. Pass the bar and be a practitioner from day one.
Right.
You said law school was pretty much the same from the first day to the last day.
Yeah.
And it involves reading comprehension, right?
Yeah.
That's like the essential skill. And you were a technical writer before you went to law school.
Yeah.
And you were what's called a non-traditional student. You were 30 years old. You had work experience, and you were a technical writer. How did being a technical writer help you in law school?
Maybe attention to detail. Okay, because when you're a technical writer, you have to explain things very clearly and very concisely, because the only chance you have of explaining how this program works is what you write down, right? You don't have a chance to answer questions in technical writing.
Were you a software technical writer?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of the reason why Socrates never wrote anything. Socrates said that he didn't write anything because there's no chance for a dialogue when you write something, right? It's just there in black and white. And so as a technical writer, you're forced to try to learn how to explain things as clearly, as concisely as possible, because you only got one shot, like firing an arrow, right? And I think that when you're in law school and you're reading a case, these cases are multiple pages long, right? It's not like the judge highlights something for you and says, hey, this is the important part, here's the rule, no, they go on and on and on. You have to dig through it and find out what's important. And so I think that attention to the details of words and grammar and language, which is really what law is all about. Law is about language, interpreting language, manipulating language to suit your client, right? I think that it's all kind of a one of a kind. Yeah.
Right. And so law school burned you out. You took some time off and came back and started working for Liberty Mutual Insurance Company and workers' compensation. Yeah. Is that your main focus now, workers' compensation law?
Yeah. We did criminal defense for a few years, but the workers' comp part of our practice grew. And so we've been 100% defense, which means we represent the employers and the insurance companies in workers' compensation cases. Yeah, that's what we do.
Well, as a matter of fact, you're really successful in that. Can you talk about the awards you won as the 8th Annual Diverse Supplier Achievement Award and how that came about?
Yeah, this is kind of crazy. About 10 years into our practice, we were doing our best, but it was I think we were only marginally better than our competition, than other law firms. And we got frustrated. And so, we developed this litigation strategy called breaking the habit. And basically it means breaking the habit of doing discovery. You know, litigation defense, right? Personal
Right.
injury, workers' comp. It's all about discovery. You depose
Medical records, work records,
all of that,
accident report, eyewitness
right?
account.
You
Yeah.
got it. And after 3 years of that, and 3 years of legal bills, the case ends up, lasting 3 years and costing $100,000 on average. And so we thought, first of all, who sued who here, right? The employee sued the employer, which means who has the burden of proof, right? The legal burden of proving the claim? The employee.
Right.
The employer doesn't have the burden of proof. So who really needs all that discovery? The employee needs it, right? The defendant doesn't really need a lot of discovery. And so all this discovery that defense attorneys have been doing inadvertently, unintentionally helped the plaintiff make their case and show that they had a work injury and show how bad it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Totally unintended consequences. And so we broke the habit of doing discovery. We started filing the paperwork to go to court as soon as we legally could to either settle the case or go to trial and try to basically avoid as much discovery as possible. So when you settle the case quick like that, the plaintiff, the opposing party, doesn't have that much discovery, so their case isn't worth that much. And even if it goes to trial and you lose, the award is smaller because there's just not that much evidence, right? And what happened was, and we sent all of our case results to an actuary, they confirmed that we close cases on average about 60% faster than the statewide average and 60% cheaper than the statewide average. And California is like a $16, $17 billion market.
Right. Less expensive, not cheap.
Yeah, there you go. Less expensive. Thank you. Right. Because I don't like being a lawyer, man. I don't like all that. It's too fancy for me. I'm just plain English. But thank you. Right.
Yeah. Less expensive. That's great because what you did was you went outside the box and you got creative with regards to servicing and satisfying your client.
Yeah.
And what I find in my experience and practice is anytime I come up with something creative in court,
what happens?
They're very reluctant to entertain it because they make law rote and procedural when law is really not rote and procedural.
You're 100% correct.
It is. I mean, because what happens is the court and our corporate clients are interested in proficiency and efficiency, and they don't want to change up the model that they have, right?
Yeah.
But then in order to solve the problem, sometimes you have to innovate and you have to look at it differently. And in order to get the best result for your client, it can't always be rote. And so I really appreciate how you all did that. That's fascinating.
You hit the nail on the head because the strategy itself is very simple, right? I mean, recognize who has the burden of proving the case and don't do their job for them, right? Force them to prove their case. It goes back to like 1800 BC when Hammurabi, this Babylonian king, did this famous code of law called the Code of Hammurabi. And the big part of the code was if you bring a claim, you have to prove it. And he said, if you don't prove your claim, you should be executed. I mean, he was very draconian there.
Wow.
But yeah, so the strategy, is very simple, but executing it is hard because when you're innovating, when you're disrupting, people don't like that, right? They feel threatened. They feel uncomfortable. Habits are a place of comfort for us, right? There's a very huge emotional, psychological component here. So it's hard. Executing the strategy has been very, very hard. But, we've been blessed. I mean, if you try to do something good, right? If you try to do something, if your heart's in the right place and you hang in there, I think good things come.
Has implementing breaking the habit been a success for you and your clients, and has it increased your work?
Yeah, it has been a success because we've been able to sort of separate ourselves from competition. And I think that's one thing I like about workers' compensation. I don't really care for workers' compensation itself, but it's sufficiently complicated that if you get good at it, you have an opportunity to separate yourself, right? I mean, just imagine some type of law that's very, very rote and form-driven, right? And not really complicated. It's hard for a lawyer to sort of excel, right? And climb a mountaintop if there's no mountains to climb, you know what I mean? And, when you're a lawyer, if you can separate yourself a bit from the competition, that helps because there's no shortage of lawyers, right?
Right.
We're in a competitive business. We're all capitalists in a sense. I mean, even if you're working for a firm, so that's one thing I like about workers' comp is that it's sufficiently complex that you can create a gap, right?
Is breaking the habit, is breaking the habit a marketable product that you can allow other lawyers and other jurisdictions to use?
Yeah. So, brilliant question. Breaking a habit, of course, is a legal strategy. You can't really trademark a legal strategy. We trademarked the phrase breaking a habit for marketing purposes. Would it work outside of workers' compensation? Absolutely. I think it would work in any kind of litigation in this country where there's a pleading followed by discovery, followed by eventually it's a settlement or a trial, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can eliminate and minimize some of the discovery and you're representing the defense. Breaking the habit will help you. So it'll work in other, what they call lines of insurance, other jurisdictions, other states, even in other countries, although I don't think other countries go so crazy with discovery like we do in this country. So it would work, but here's the catch. We found that a lot of people in this industry, and it's a $17 billion industry, California workers' comp, don't really care that much about cycle time, and which is the length of time that a case is open, or cost per case, unless they personally lose money when a claim is filed. Okay. Now think about it. An employer who has insurance doesn't really personally lose money when a claim is filed because they pay a premium once a year, right? And that's all they pay. The ones who lose money are like self-insured employers. They tend to, right, care. But then again, if it's a huge employer like some government entity, a school district, who really cares, right?
Right.
It's self-insured employers that are sort of a mom and pop thing, right? They're the ones who built that business from scratch. And when they get a claim, they lose money out of their pocket. They're the ones who really care about how long this case is open or how much it costs. And so, although the strategy, it's ancient, it's 4,000 years old, it can work in any line, in any jurisdiction, it doesn't really get traction unless you have a client who personally loses money when claims last on and on and on and cost excessive,
So people can contact you for training and insight how to promote and put forth these strategies, correct?
They could, but I've become a bit cynical about it because it's really hard to find people who care,
Right.
and the opposition is overwhelming sometimes. I mean, it's not just the opposing counsel, right? Obviously, if you want to go to court and close discovery while they're trying to still make their case,
Right.
they're going to object. The
Right.
judges object because judges like discovery because it's easier for judges to judge if there's a lot of discovery and evidence, right?
And some judges, and I hate to say this, there are judges that like to develop the law and they like the work and they like the stories and they enjoy the stories and the facts. And they're judges because they enjoy it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
you take the ball out of their hand. You say, hey, you're not. It's kind of like I always look at referees in sporting contests and I go, who decides they want to be a referee? Are they there because they enjoy the game, or are they there because they want to be an arbiter of a game being played fair? And I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it makes me think of something else about American law, which is unique compared to most other countries. America has the adversarial legal system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most other countries in the world have an inquisitorial legal system where the law and the procedure is to inquire and find out what the truth is, what really happened in this case, right? And so judges
You have to hide the ball.
Yeah,
right?
judges in other courts, Europe, the Middle East, judges ask questions of witnesses to try to figure out what happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in America, judges are referees, just like you said. In fact, in California, until the 1980s, workers' comp judges were literally called referees.
No
They're
way.
They're not there to find out what happened. They're there to ensure a fair fight, right? The American legal system is all about a fair process, right? And so the name of the game in American law litigation is not so much finding out the truth, it's winning. It's a game. I don't mean to be crude about it, right? But going back to the OJ case, right? Was that case really about the truth of the matter, or was it about winning? and the lawyers who had the better strategies and the better tactics, right? Stuff like that.
I'm going to ask you an objectional question.
Okay.
So that means that you can object and answer, or object and refuse to answer.
I'll go for it.
O.J. Simpson,
Yeah.
guilty or innocent?
Yeah, he was guilty. There was enough evidence there, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think, see, this is what I think. I think their theory was wrong.
Okay.
There's no way in the hell he did it all by himself. He's
Good
a
point.
super athlete.
Yeah.
He's superhuman.
Yeah.
Without question, he could, physically dominate his wife and do things with a knife that maybe an ordinary person couldn't do.
Mhm.
But to assault the healthy Ron Goldman, who was in tip-top shape, and Nicole, and then be so little blood in his car, I thought that he was definitely involved with it, but more than likely, someone helped him, and their one-person theory, I think, hurt them.
Yeah, and I wonder, going back to Johnny Cochran's, what did he say? Rush to guilt or rush to judgment?
Yeah, rush to judgment. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if that happened in the investigation stage. If they ruled out an accomplice maybe a little too quick. I don't know.
I think they ruled out an accomplice too quick.
Yeah.
I think the brutality of the murder and the lack of evidence inside the Bronco. So you look at all the blood and you look at the bloody shoe print. I have to refresh my recollection, but the amount of blood that was on the car and in the car was very small, and so it's kind of tricky. And I'm a deer hunter, and I gut deer on my own. And you got a deer and you use the knife to do it, blood gets everywhere. There's some guys that can do it really artfully, but I mean, the kind of massacre that OJ was involved in, I think, required an accomplice. So it's controversial for me to say that. People are going to say, "Oh, he didn't do it," But the evidence, in my opinion, he was involved. Something happened, and he is responsible for the passing of those two individuals. He had some hand in it, so to speak.
And if
hand or uncut.
And if the OJ case was tried in France, or Italy, we might have a better handle on whether there was accomplice or not, because they have the inquisitorial legal system and they would have inquired about that.
Right.
But in America, the court really didn't care. The court was just there to referee a fair fight.
Why did you decide to pursue civil law instead of criminal law after seeing the OJ case?
Well, again, going back to law school, I kind of got burned out on law. I didn't want to have anything to do with law. And really, it was kind of a cop-out that I got a job as a lawyer. I'll admit it.
You've been wildly successful.
I'm sorry?
You've been wildly successful. You've had your own practice now for how many years?
Yeah, we've had our own practice for 16 years.
Yeah, 16 years.
I mean, part of it
You've
is
been practicing now for 20 years. 21 years.
Yeah.
22, yeah.
I think part of it is, Sean, I'm competitive.
Right. Yeah, you are.
I want to win. Whatever I do, it's just, and I don't know if it's so much I want to defeat other people, but I want to be the best I can be. You got one life to live, and then when it's over, that's it. As far as our earthly existence. So,
how do you keep your energy high, Albert? You've always been so positive and high, and I'll just say this: like you are. I mean, there are a couple of people that are definitely directly responsible for me being successful as a lawyer, and directly responsible for keeping my spirits high and attitude high. And you're one of those people. And there's another friend of mine by the name of Brian Wolfolk, who I have slated to interview one day, who've kept my energy high and positive as a lawyer. How do you keep your energy high, and how do you remain positive? Because it's a really tough profession.
Yeah, you're really kind to say that. It is a very tough profession. I don't know. Part of it is probably my upbringing. My parents were happily married. I was an only child, and I had a very safe, stable, comfortable environment to grow up in, and play. And they let me go to school. They let me try different jobs and go back to school and back and forth. So I think part of it's my upbringing. Part of it might just be my personality. Mm-hmm. Part of it might just be.
When's your birthday? What's your sign?
November 22nd, 1965.
Oh, you what? Scorpio, brother?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm November 6th. We're Scorpio brothers. No wonder why we get along so well.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, we're Scorpio brothers. Dang
So
it.
that, that might explain some of it too. But
Yeah.
I don't know. And, a lot of life is about your attitude and your effort, right? Whatever happens, you have the freedom to choose your attitude about it. You can look at a mountain as an obstacle. You can look at a mountain as protective barrier. You could look at a mountain as a beautiful thing. You could look at a mountain as a place you want to ski down. Right? The attitude you take about anything in your life, it's up to you to choose your attitude. And then second, it's up to you to decide how much effort to put into it, right? Do you and going back to law and how difficult it is, and it's a tough business, man. I mean, we're very, very heavily regulated lawyers, the way we can get business, right? It's extremely competitive. There's a glut of lawyers, yet we are restricted in the way we can run around and get business, right? Then when you get a case, think about it. If you do litigation, pretty much everybody is unhappy, right? The plaintiff is unhappy because they feel they were injured. The defendant is unhappy because they feel they're wrongfully sued, right? And then each side gets vendors and different parties that help. They all polarize, and everybody's you know what I mean? There's no middle anymore.
The experts, their medical opinions, their assessment of the injury, the quality of life after the injury.
This is a very unpleasant. It can be a very unpleasant environment to operate in. And so, what's your attitude towards that? You know what I mean?
Yep.
Do you have a healthy attitude? And how hard do you want to work at that? Do you want to try to change that or improve it or make it more efficient or get better outcomes in your cases? Or, it's up to you, right?
Right.
It's all up to you.
Let's do a shift in our conversation. One of the things I really like about you, Albert, is that you are extremely well studied and you love to share the information that you accrue and acquire. And then you think outside of the box and say, how can I share this information? And the best way to share information throughout the course of history is writing it down.
Good old fashioned.
Good old fashioned writing it down. Good old fashioned typeset on a piece of paper. Albert is an author. He's written books on constitutional law, and he's also written books on joy of the argument. He talked about the Socratic method and Socrates not writing anything down, but rather going through a verbal or oral discussion to get to get to the truth of the matter. But because of the state of our country and the history of our country and what's going on now, I'd like to focus on your book regarding constitutional law. You can get that on Amazon, correct?
Yeah. Yep. It's on Amazon. Yeah.
All right. What's the name of your book?
It's called The Elements of Constitutional Law.
Why did you decide to write that book? And you're practicing in workers' compensation and criminal defense primarily, or more so just workers' compensation right now?
Yeah, part of it, it was that I still wanted out of law, right? Even while I was practicing workers' comp defense, I wanted out. And so I thought, well, if I write a bunch of books on the law, maybe I can make money from books and then retire from the practice of law. Then another thing happened. This was around 2010, the Tea Party. A lot of people were talking about their constitutional rights, especially if they weren't happy about something. They'd say, "Oh, that's not constitutional," right? But you would rarely hear somebody cite part of the Constitution like an article or a case, an actual constitutional law case. And so I thought, well, I'm writing this book for law students primarily, but maybe the general public might want to learn a little bit about the Constitution, right? And what it's all about. So that was kind of the motivation for writing the book.
I love that you pointed out that you were originally writing it for law students, but then you shifted to increase your audience. And I think that is one of the most important things, that you increased your audience for the general public, because the general public doesn't have a good understanding of the Constitution. One of the things that's really hot right now is the First Amendment, and whether or not the First Amendment applies or whether or not it doesn't apply. Can you tell us when it applies and when it doesn't apply?
Yeah, the First Amendment basically protects you against state action. In other words, action by the government. So, and the First Amendment does not apply to stuff that just happens between private citizens. So a lot of people will say something and say, well, that's my First Amendment right. Well, if the government's not trying to shut you up, the First Amendment doesn't even care,
Hmm.
or they might talk about what someone else is saying, they have a First Amendment right to say that. Yeah, but if the government's not trying to silence them, the First Amendment doesn't really apply. So that's one thing about the First Amendment. It only applies to what we call state action, action by the government.
Well, let's look at what's happening now.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, our president, the voice
Yeah.
of America, because he's the chief executive. Although there's a part of the populace that is disgruntled with him and unhappy with him, he's been silenced, so to speak, by newspaper outlets, internet outlets.
Yeah, social media.
And social media, Facebook and Twitter. Now, some people go, oh, that's violative of the Constitution. Well, it's not, right, Albert? And why is it not?
Because those are not state actors, right? Twitter, Facebook are not state actors. They're not government. They're just private companies or publicly held companies, but they're not government operators, government agents, so to speak. So
they're not like your Department of Defense. They're not the governor's office of the state of California.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Pretty brave, that falls into just corporate ethics, right? And what the corporation thinks is ethical or the right thing to do or not. And it doesn't really have anything to do with the Constitution.
I don't know if you've given this any thought or insight. I think about these things all the time, and my wife says I'm nuts because I think about them. But thankfully, there's 3 million of us that are nuts, and we're all lawyers. I think there's 3 million lawyers in America, something like that.
Sounds about right.
But when I look at Twitter banning Trump and Facebook banning President Trump, I do look at a certain constitutional issue because there was a time where President Trump on Twitter or Facebook went to block dissenters on Facebook and Twitter. And it went to court, and the court says, no, you cannot block these people, President Trump, because what you're creating is a public record, and you can't censor these people from commenting on your tweets or tweeting back to you. So he went to delete or block responders, their tweets, and the court said he couldn't do it, and there was a constitutional reason why he couldn't do it. And I thought it was fascinating. I never read the opinion or anything, but I thought, I didn't feel any reason why I should examine it because my initial gut feeling was the court was right. And it's like, why does the president get to silence someone? And that's what he was doing.
Well, interestingly enough, that would be a First Amendment issue because the president is the government, right? He's a state actor. Here you go.
Interesting.
Yeah. Otherwise, it wouldn't even have got into court,
Right. So he didn't have a right to silence them on the platform, but the platform has a right to silence him. Isn't that strange?
Think about the action. Who's taking the action? Is it the government or is it a private citizen? Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. That's basically how it breaks down. And again, a basic element of constitutional law that a lot of people aren't familiar with. You know what I mean? So when they're running around saying, it's not constitutional or this or that, look, whatever side you're on, your argument is going to be more persuasive if it's more, better informed, right? Know the law, know the facts.
Now, people often refer to a part of the Constitution called the Bill of Rights, Albert. What is a Bill of Rights?
Well, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and they are mostly about individual liberties, like the First Amendment. We've just been talking about that, right? Freedom of speech, religion, press. The Second Amendment, right to bear arms, and so on. The Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. It's mostly about individual rights, and you might wonder, why are these things amendments? Why weren't they in the original Constitution? And the reason was there was a big debate about that. A lot of people thought they should have been in the original Constitution, but a lot of other people thought they should not be in the original Constitution. And the reason was that people thought if you put all these amendments, all this stuff about individual rights in the Constitution, then there's an argument that the government can interfere with rights that aren't in the Constitution, right? So remember the Bill of Rights, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and all that, Sixth Amendment right to confront your accusers. These things protect individual rights. And the framers of the Constitution, most of them thought, well, if you put all these specific individual rights in the Constitution and we just leave an important individual right out, that might mean that the government can interfere with that, right? And so that's kind of why they were not in the original Constitution. But just like 4 years after the Constitution was, ratified and everything, just 4 years after the Bill of Rights were ratified,
Wow,
So,
the Bill of Rights ratification came after the ratification of the Constitution. That's
yeah, like 4 years. So pretty quickly, everybody came to a consensus and said, you know what, this stuff needs to be in there. But here's the protection. The Ninth and 10th Amendments kind of took care of that issue. The Ninth Amendment says, basically, just because a right is not in the Constitution doesn't mean that the government can interfere with that right, right? And the 10th Amendment says that the powers that are not reserved to the federal government go to the states, right? The 10th Amendment police power. So the 10th Amendment state police powers to regulate the health, safety, welfare, moral, environment, aesthetics, and all that stuff. So when you look at the 10th, 9th, and 10th Amendments, they're basically the protection for those original framers who thought, man, if we don't put it in there, does that mean that, the government can mess with it? So it all kind of worked out, and it all kind of shows something magnificent about the Constitution, which is the way that it balances competing interests and powers. We're all born and raised with a Constitution, right? But for most of human history, most governments were monarchies without a Constitution, right?
And that's why it was written, right? To make sure we never had a monarchy again, right?
Yeah. You know what a monarchy is? That's where you are ruled by a king or a queen. And the only interest.
George.
Yeah. John, George, Philip. And the only interest that mattered was the king's interest, right? And if you had a good king or a queen who took into consideration the interest of the people, great. But if you had a bad king who was only self-interested, or you had an indifferent king, then the people aren't going to do so well, right? And so a constitution, the first thing a constitution does is recognize and protect the interest of the people, right? Really super important thing about a constitution. And now all of a sudden, you got competing interests. You got the individual interests of people, and you have the state interests, right? Because just because you have a constitution and rule by law instead of a rule by a king doesn't mean that the state goes away, right? The state governments are still there. The federal government is still there, but now you've got competing interests. You got interests of the people competing against interests of the state, federal and state government, right? Which need to be balanced. And that's the second thing that the Constitution does, is it balances all these competing interests, right? Your individual interest in speaking your mind, or having an abortion, or worshiping, versus the state's interest in, keeping things safe, or protecting the life of the unborn fetus, right?
Mm-hmm. Is abortion in the Constitution?
No, it's not, which is a big misconception about the Constitution. People think, well, what does the Constitution say, right? People think that the Constitution has a specific answer for every specific problem. It doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. The Constitution is written very generically, like most laws are, it's up to the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution in the context of a specific fact pattern, right? And so there's always some interpretation there. Some people say, oh, we should just read it strictly and literally. What that means is don't go crazy when you're interpreting the Constitution, right? Don't just invent things out of a hat, right? But the Constitution does not answer everything, and the Supreme Court justices have to interpret it.
So the Constitution, its last and final stop for interpretation is the Supreme Court. Right?
It's like a little choo-choo train.
Right. Explain that metaphor. It's like a little choo-choo train.
Yeah, well, it's the last and final stop, right? The Supreme Court, Marbury versus Madison, 1803. The Supreme Court has the power to interpret the Constitution and is the final word on the Constitution, right? Unless you amend the Constitution. So whatever the Supreme Court says is final, which is why presidential elections are so important, because
Mhm.
presidents nominate justices to the Supreme Court, right? And we've seen a lot of nominations in the last, 10 years,
Right.
which changed the makeup of the court. And as much as I tried to explain in my book that the Constitution is a body of laws, understandable laws, the Constitution is interpreted by human beings, right? Who
Right.
have, they're human,
Biases.
they have biases,
Yeah.
right? And so it matters who you nominate or elect as president, because that person is going to nominate justices, and that person is going to interpret the Constitution and decide whether voting is a fundamental right,
Right.
or abortion is a fundamental right, or gay marriage is a fundamental right, or healthcare is a fundamental right, right?
Is voting in the Constitution?
Yeah, it's in the Constitution in a few different places. It's in the 15th Amendment, which prohibits denying the right to vote based on race or other things. It's in the 24th Amendment, which prohibits requiring a poll tax, basically a tax to vote. It's in the 26th Amendment, which says that 18 is the voting age. And then a famous Supreme Court case, Harper versus Virginia. Virginia had a poll tax because the state basically wanted to prevent blacks from voting, right? Blacks and a lot of poor whites couldn't afford to pay $1.50 to vote. So Virginia had this poll tax, and the Supreme Court struck it down, said it's unconstitutional, not because the Constitution itself said you can't have a poll tax, but because the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution guaranteed due process, and under due process, the court said that voting is a fundamental right. And
Is voting part of the Bill of Rights or anywhere in the fundamental rights of the Constitution?
it's not listed as a fundamental right, right?
Wow.
But the Supreme Court looked at the Fifth Amendment and said it's a fundamental right. And so what that means is, and there's only like 10 fundamental rights under the Constitution. What that means is if the government, state or federal, right, state actor, right, if any state actor tries to interfere with one of these fundamental rights, travel, marriage, procreation, voting, if any state actor tries to interfere with a fundamental right, it's going to be unconstitutional, almost presumptively unconstitutional, unless it's absolutely necessary to further a compelling state interest, which means it's pretty much the only way to accomplish a really vital, compelling state interest, right?
Right.
So when the Supreme Court said that voting was a fundamental right, that was a big deal.
What year was that?
Harper versus Virginia was, in the 60s, I think. I don't remember the exact year.
So it's interesting that America was voting and selecting presidents from, Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776.
Yeah.
And then the Constitution came how many years after the Declaration of Independence? It didn't come like, what is that, 11 years after, right? But yet we were still voting and electing presidents. And then when the Constitution was finalized and ratified, voting wasn't listed as a fundamental right. That's shocking. I have to do some research on that. That's weird.
Oh, yeah. And you'll come across a bunch of cases in Texas called the white primary cases, where Texas was basically trying to disenfranchise blacks.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one case after another where the state of Texas was trying one thing after another to try to prevent blacks from voting. One of the famous ones was, what was it? It was the All Right case, where the state of Texas had a primary that basically only allowed whites to vote, and one by one, the Supreme Court struck them down, and this wasn't that long ago. It was not that long ago, so it's so, it kind of shows how long things take to evolve, and it's all the credit goes to the Constitution, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the credit goes to the Constitution, the way that it balances these competing interests of individuals versus the state, the way it balances the powers, right? Federal power, or government power versus individual, but also federal power versus state power, and the way it evolves over time as our country evolves over time,
Let me ask you a question, and this is important because I hear statements made about the Constitution all the time. And one of the popular statements is that the Constitution is a limit on what the government can do. It's not a limit on what I can do. It's a limit on what the government can do and what the government can do to me. Can you explain that
Yeah,
dichotomy or
yeah,
the conflict between that
yeah.
statement?
For the most part, that's true. It's the Constitution is a limit on federal power, and so the Constitution basically explains what all the federal powers are, um, and the whatever's left out of the Constitution goes to the states. That's the 10th Amendment police power, right? Um, and so that's kind of the main thing. But when you think about it, there are some limits on what individuals can do. For example, when it comes to free speech, you can't be running around, advocating unlawful conduct or, inciting unlawful action, right? You can say that you're exercising your freedom of speech, but the state has an interest in promoting health and safety and welfare and all that stuff, right? So if the state thinks they need to shut you up to prevent a riot, the Supreme Court's going to uphold that, basically. So,
Right.
yeah. So, for the most part, the Constitution is a limit on government power, but there are instances where individuals are sort of held in check.
Looking at the political environment of today and speech and where the government can shut you up, our President Trump was impeached for a second time. He holds the record. I saw this sensational
Headline.
newspaper, headline, and it goes, "Trump smashes the records for impeachment." Because he got impeached twice. It's funny, we laugh about it, right? And then people are saying there's a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
And can you explain if there's a constitutional crisis and whether or not it's real, or is there no constitutional crisis? And does impeachment mean that there's a constitutional crisis?
Okay, so think about the federal government and what the main responsibilities of the federal government are, right? What do you mainly expect from the federal government? Probably at the top of the list is to protect national security, right? Just keep us safe. We can't take that for granted. And when you think about the constitutional, when you think about all the agencies and departments that are working every day, 24/7, right, to protect our national security, the CIA, the NSA, Homeland Security, the FBI. When you think about the Pentagon, right, which houses the armed forces, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, the Army, the Coast Guard. When you think about all the operatives that are running around in foreign countries gathering intel, when you think about the people operating drones, when you think about the cybersecurity professionals in this country, when you think about this, all the hardworking career professionals, that are working night and day, whatever you are doing, sleeping, enjoying your life, working, watching Netflix, for the most part, they're doing a pretty good job, right? And all their powers come from the Constitution. So in that sense, there is no constitutional crisis, right?
Right. No constitutional crisis. It's just the Constitution's working, and they have to rely on provisions that they don't normally have to rely upon in their normal congressional or legislative lives, correct?
Yeah. And I mean, the crisis, I think if there's a crisis, there's a lot of, it might be more of a culture crisis, than a constitutional crisis. It's more about the diverse social economic stratus in this country. if you travel around the country, if you go to different states, if you go from, urban areas to rural areas, you'll see this country is not homogeneous, man. There are parts of this country where education is better or worse. There are parts of this country where law enforcement is more effective or less.
Mhm.
Parts of this country where their job opportunities are more or less. And when you asked me like, where do I get all my energy from? A lot of it was just the luck of my birth. The time, the place, the family, La Mirada, the suburb that I was born into, where I was allowed to grow, without any massive insecurities and stuff like that. When you look at this country, it's very diverse, and I'm not just talking about everybody coming from boats and planes and going to Staten Island and all that. I'm talking
Right.
about the way we live, the way we're educated, the way that we're taken care of, and all that. And when you have these different circumstances, everybody has different attitudes about stuff, right?
Mhm.
They have different opportunities, they have different hopes and dreams, if they have any hopes and dreams at all, right? And that's, if there's a crisis in this country, that's really what it is. We're not Sweden. Everybody talks about how great the education in Denmark is, or the healthcare in Sweden is. Get out of my face, man. None of those countries
Right.
have 10 million people, okay?
Mhm.
It's like 30 million people within a 2-hour radius of where I'm sitting right here. I could fit 3 Swedens within a 2-hour drive of where I am. So managing a country with 10 or less million people is nothing like managing the United States of America, right? So I hesitate to say it's even a crisis, because we're doing okay. We're not perfect. We could do better, but considering our size, we're doing okay. We should keep trying to do better. And the Constitution's there as a backstop of support for us, right? To let us
Mhm.
go out and do our things.
Now, you pointed out that we're not a homogeneous nation. That means that we're a diverse nation of many different types of people, of like DNA heritage, so to speak. Um, Explain how the Constitution applies to everybody who's an American, or
Yeah,
or seeking American citizenship,
yeah,
or is present inside our borders. That's what's so fascinating about our Constitution. If you become present inside our borders or our territory, the Constitution applies to you. Explain that beauty.
yeah. That's a really interesting question you asked there, because there was a case where there were a couple of cases, immigration cases, and one involved an immigrant who actually landed on American soil, right? And the Supreme Court said that once they land on American soil, they are entitled to due process, right?
Yeah,
That and due
fascinating.
process is in the Constitution, and what it means is you have the right to notice of the issue, opportunity to be heard in court, and an impartial decision maker, somebody who's impartial to decide, right, whether you should stay or go.
Hopefully, you get an impartial decision.
Yeah, right.
That
But
hasn't been always the history, but
there was another case where the person was outside U.S. jurisdiction, and in that case, the Supreme Court said that due process is whatever Congress says it is. In other words,
wow.
you kind of
Isn't
already know.
that kind of like a colonialist attitude? Because I always point out to people, I'm like, the force of American law is within our territories and our borders. The force of American law applied outside of the United States, in my opinion, would be unconstitutional.
Yeah, yeah. So, and then that's another. It's these cases
That's
are.
tricky.
It is, and it's a balancing of different interests, right? The
Mhm.
interest of the federal government, the interest of the person who wants to enter the United States, like, right, legally. That's what the Constitution tries to do, is balance these interests. But it's basically it's there for everybody. All these heavy duty clauses of the amendments, due process, equal protection. They're not just words, man. They're real, and that is, not to be overly romantic about it, but that is something special about the United States that if, for example, um, the state is trying to take away your life or your liberty or your property, I don't care who you are going to get a basic level of due process. You have that opportunity, okay? If you are in XYZ country, that's not always the case,
Right.
right? Same for free speech. If you uh, want to use social media or the sidewalk in front of the city hall or any forum you want, to express your views, you are going to get basic protections, and it's going to be very difficult for the government to interfere with your speech.
Well, they can interfere at the moment because they can stop you from talking, and it could be unconstitutional what they're doing because police do it all the time. They just go, "Oh, we don't want you to talk," and they haul you away, and then you got to go through the whole judicial process to get an opportunity to talk. But they can stop you for the moment, right? But you would have the opportunity for redress, and more than likely you'll win.
Yeah, exactly. Not the case in every other country, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you want to worship this god or that pantheon of gods, or you don't want to worship at all, believe me, you don't have this freedom in every other country in this world, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way you dress in this country, don't take that for granted. You can't just dress any old way you want in every country in this world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. You get on a plane and then pull up your phone and start watching videos, not even thinking about the safety of the aircraft, right? Or the pilot and his or her experience or training. These things, the steak that you eat, everything, many of the aspects of our daily lives are regulated and protected by the state and federal government, by agencies that are created by Congress using their constitutional powers. So there is hardly anything in your life that is not touched by the Constitution. And I know you may have complaints, and you should complain, right?
Right. We're supposed to complain. That's what it's about.
Yeah, right. But have some balance in your own life. I talked a lot about balance. Have some balance in your own life and balance in your own perspectives, and think, wow, there's a lot of things in this country that are pretty wonderful and unique.
Yeah. I don't know how much more time you have left, but I got a couple more questions if you don't mind. Do you have a little more time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Does the Constitution provide for the Electoral College? And was it originally there, or did it come about at a different time in our history?
It came about at a different time. It's one of the amendments, the 12th Amendment. And it's kind of interesting. The framers of the Constitution had a couple of problems. One is that if you had a direct election, okay, no electoral college, right? Just you vote, I vote, whoever gets the most votes win. If you had a direct election, way back then, slaves could not vote. And so the southern states would have less influence, less political representation, right? Another problem is that if you had a direct election, right, you vote, I vote, whoever gets the most votes wins, the big cities would get a disproportionate political power, right? And the rural areas would get less political representation. And so Congress is trying to figure out some options. One option was, okay, what if Congress chooses the president? I mean, that was an option. They considered it, but then they thought, then the president's not going to be too independent, right? If Congress chooses the president. Another option was, well, what if we have
That's happened in a city I know, Moreno Valley, California. The council members select the mayor year after year, and it's a disaster.
Well, it shows a lack of independence, right?
Right.
That was another option that the framers considered, is like, okay, what if a small group of people choose the president, like a little oligarchy? But again, appearance of impropriety. Why did they really choose that guy? Was something going on under the table? So what they did was they did a compromise, which is the Electoral College, right? And what it does is it still gives big states a say, right? And the political influence that they deserve because they're big states. But it also gives smaller states a stake in the elections too, and a chance to swing the election. And we've seen in recent decades, some small states serve a big role as swing states, right? You're like, what? The whole election's going to turn on that state? I mean,
So, in my opinion, I always told people that I think the Electoral College is genius, especially for a democratic republic, because states with smaller populations have a say. So, like Idaho,
yeah,
North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming,
New
Montana,
Hampshire,
New
New
Hampshire,
Hampshire's got
right?
4 electoral
And then
votes.
and then for me, the folly argument always comes along as like, oh, the slaves states only wanted it. And I'm like, well, the states I just mentioned right now weren't slave states.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
at all. They were like the new expansion states in America, manifest destiny, but they weren't quote unquote slave states, and they weren't concerned about a slave populace that could outvote the white populace. But it was more about them having a say
Yeah,
in the elected chief executive officer.
right. And the reason why people complain about the Electoral College is in those cases where the candidate with the most votes loses because that candidate didn't have the most electoral votes, right?
Mhm.
So obviously that seems kind of weird. But when you think about what would happen if you had a direct election and how certain states would dominate and urban areas would dominate, that's a problem too. And so the Electoral College might not be perfect, but it still seems necessary. It still seems the best compromise solution we can come up with.
Mhm. Does the Constitution deal with the smooth transition of power, one chief executive, the president, transitioning to a new chief executive?
Yeah, not so much.
Mhm.
About I don't know, 50 years ago, there was an act, Presidential Transition Act. They created the Government Services Agency, GSA,
So only
and
50 years ago?
something like that. Yeah,
Wow. So it was like a gentleman's agreement, maybe, that there was going
yeah,
to be a smooth transition of power.
yeah, yeah. And what this agency does, GSA, is they basically handle all the logistics of the transition. They help set up offices, um, infrastructure, whatever's needed for the president elect, the vice president elect, his or her staff, and all that stuff. So this was not in the Constitution; it was an act of Congress. And then another thing that's really important during the transition is national security. Right, the president elect starts getting the president's daily briefings, which is this classified analysis of national security issues, covert operations, and all that. And it's produced by all those agencies I mentioned before. The Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, actually produces it, but it's an amalgamation of stuff from CIA, NSA, Homeland Security, FBI, and all that stuff. And that's a really important part of the transition too, right? Because when the new president steps into office, that person needs to be prepared, right? Just like when a
Yeah.
lawyer steps into court, you need to be
The
prepared.
Constitution doesn't necessarily spell out everything that's supposed to happen. I know they say that the president shall serve for a term, and then it designates that they can only serve for 2 consecutive terms, I think.
Yeah,
And then they give a date specific as to when the new president must be sworn in and that president's term ends, right?
exactly.
But there's nothing in the Constitution that says there shall be a peaceful transition of power, right?
No, I guess the framers trusted us to
Yeah.
just be professional about it, right?
Hmm.
And professionalism is not in the Constitution. I
You
think it's
can't
just
codify behavior in the Constitution, right?
it's hard.
And they
I
expect it,
mean,
though.
at the extremes you can, like advocating unlawful conduct or
Hmm.
obscenity and stuff like that. But it's hard. Certain things are just assumed that we're going to act in a professional manner and do your duty. A lot of these people, I mean, they take an oath. They have sworn duties, right, to uphold the Constitution. What does that mean? Well, now we know a little bit more what that means, right? It's not
Right.
just about following your own self-interest. That's what the monarchs did, right? We got a constitution that recognizes everybody's interest. So that's kind of what they're supposed to do, and that's what you hope. And Man, I just hope we get the best. I think we should all be doing our best, right? Whether you're a politician or a citizen, whether you're an elected official or a concerned citizen, I hope you're doing your best to fulfill that role.
What would you say to a person who says the Constitution didn't apply to me when it was originally written? It only applied to wealthy white men, and we need to scrap the whole thing, start over, and rewrite it. What would you say to that person?
You can try. It's going to be really hard. Okay. So from a practical perspective, don't hold your breath. But I would try to make you feel a little bit better in that whatever gaps or holes or blind spots, cultural blind spots, right? Racial blind spots that were in the original Constitution have been repaired to a large extent.
Right.
200 some years of U.S. Supreme Court cases, one after another, looking at all these issues, right? Especially the fundamental rights, the right to travel, the right to marry, right? The right to marry was not a fundamental right. So states could prevent blacks from marrying whites.
Right.
That got fixed. The right to procreate, the right to contraceptives, the right to the fundamental right to vote, freedom of speech, all the stuff. I mean, no matter who you are, no matter what your circumstances are, the Constitution, through the Supreme Court, through the work of the Supreme Court, has been updated, upgraded, right? I don't know what version we're on now, version 2021, you can call it, right? Yeah. So I know about the old dead white man history perspective, right? But when you look at the Constitution now and the way it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court, it's a lot, it's mature, and it's caught up with even as recent as the gay marriage Supreme Court case, right? 20 years ago, this country was not ready for gay marriage as a fundamental right. It was fairly recent that states started passing gay laws, even fairly recent that other countries started recognizing gay marriage as a fundamental right? But in the last 10 years, it picked up speed. One state after another started having gay marriage laws, right? And the Supreme Court looked at that same old, tired Constitution, and then they looked at the culture and context of the current country and said, yeah, it's a fundamental right now, right? It might not have been in 1787, but it is now, right?
I mean, if you look at the document and you look at gay marriage, regardless of your, I think it's more so, masculine stance or religious stance with regards to gay marriage. If you look at it in terms of what the government can do or what the government can't do, I think it's clear that the government can't stop two adults from contracting with one another, which marriage is, and that contract does not cause exigent bodily harm to the individual, and it does not indenture or enslave the individual. How could the court ever have decided that these people couldn't contract between themselves? I mean, regardless of your political stance, right? There's a freedom of contract in the Constitution, right? And so that's what marriage is, but they made it more than that because of, masculinity, which is good, and because of religion, which is good. But when you look at it objectively, you take away masculinity and religion, it's like, how do you stop them from contracting with one another based on love?
Yeah, it's a good argument. And of course, others disagreed with that and thought that the court should have nothing to do with gay marriage and that it should be up to the states.
Is that what the conflict came down to, is whether or not the federal government had an interest in it or whether or not the states had an interest in it and they wanted to leave it to the states?
Yeah, that was a big part of it. And but this illustrates, it's it's not, this stuff isn't like math. It's not 2 plus 2 is 4. It illustrates the competing interests and how the Constitution and the Supreme Court tries to balance them, right? You've
Mhm.
got a same-sex couple that have an interest in uniting and having their union recognized officially,
And their
right?
property interests protected, their property interests and the assets and their unified interests protected.
Right. And then you have the state's interest in regulating marriage and the sanctity of marriage and protecting it and making sure that it means
The
something.
sanctity, the sanctity comes from religion. That's where it comes from.
Yeah. Okay. But it's still, a state ceremony, right? You get a
Right.
marriage.
The state
And so these are these competing interests and religion and all that. And it's not science, and I hesitate to say that, Alan, because even sometimes science we're learning and then we're like, oh crap, lobotomies aren't a good idea, mercury's not a good treatment method. So even science is kind of discovering and learning, but you get my point that it's hard. It's hard
Mhm.
to balance these interests, and sometimes we get it wrong. For decades, we get it wrong, and people are severely disadvantaged, and their interests are not sufficiently promoted or recognized officially until decades later, and sometimes
Yeah.
centuries later, right?
And sometimes
But
the Constitution is slow. That's tough.
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Bang on. Yeah, that's it. It's slow. But at least we're not Egypt. Ancient Egypt didn't change for like thousands of years. America, we're only a couple hundred years old. Look how much we've matured and advanced in just a couple hundred years, right?
Mhm.
Again, we got to be proud of how far we've advanced. So I
Yeah.
love America.
All right. So last couple of questions for you. What are the 3 most important constitutional rights every American citizen should know and be aware of?
I think the first one that comes to mind is due process. And you'll know you have a due process issue when the government, which could be federal, state, or local, is trying to take away your life, liberty, or your property, right? Because if that happens, you have a procedural due process right under the Constitution. You have the right to notice, right? What's going on? Uh, Opportunity to be heard in some kind of a forum, a court or an administrative hearing or something like that, and an impartial decision maker. So the due process clause is a big deal. I think equal protection is a big deal too.
Number 2 is equal protection.
Yeah, it's hard to prioritize these things, but
What is equal protection, Albert?
yeah, that basically means equal protection under the law. So what that basically means is that the government cannot discriminate against you unless they have a sufficiently good reason. Now, the government discriminates all the time, and it's legal. So it's not like the government can never discriminate. It's that they have to have a sufficient reason. And so we see equal protection cases across the board. Education, affirmative action, these are all, equal protection issues. I think probably a third, I'm not going to say third most important, but a third area of constitutional law that I think is very important is freedom of speech,
Yes.
right? I'm just going to call it the First Amendment because it's not just speech. The First Amendment has speech, religion, press, assembly, right? All these 4 things are in the First Amendment. And when you think about what you do in your daily life, expressing your opinion, letters to the editor, blogs, this podcast, social media, going to church or temple or mosque or wherever, or no church at all, assembly, all these things fall under the First Amendment. They're a big part. They add meaning to your life. And they're protected under the Constitution. So you put these 3 things together, man, that's not a bad country to live in.
And if you think they're being violated, what should a citizen do?
You can
Contact a lawyer, right?
Yeah, you can contact a lawyer. The ACLU is big in these things.
What does the ACLU stand for?
American Civil Liberties Union.
And they take up constitutional issues, right?
Yeah, all the time. And then but just Google constitutional lawyer near me, right? Help out a
Right.
local local lawyer.
Right.
Even some struggling constitutional law attorney around the block.
We could go on for hours talking about constitutional law and the many facets of it and its importance and its understanding and its interpretation. And so I have all these questions circling through my head, but I'm really appreciative of the valuable time that you have lent us and our audience today, and that you were so gracious enough to give us an interview today. If people want to get your book on constitutional law, how do they get it?
You could just go to Amazon and just type in my name, Albert Navarra.
How do you spell your last name, Albert?
Navarra.
Okay.
And it'll pop up. Both books will pop up. Yeah.
Okay. And what's the second book's name?
The second book is Joy of Argument.
Or the title of the second book? Joy of Argument.
Yeah. Just what you and I have experienced right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you like the Constitution and you like to argue, become a lawyer.
There you go.
People want to hire you to be their workers' compensation attorney or to be a consultant to help improve their attorney-client relationship and efficiency on how they handle cases. How would they get hold of you, Albert?
Best is my work email, Albert, Albert, at S like Sam, N like Nancy, work, that's WORK, comp, COMP.com. So just Albert at snworkcomp.com.
And what's your website?
snworkcomp.com.
And your office phone number?
Toll free, 866. We did this because we were doing criminal law. We thought, hey, I have a toll free number, right? 866-384-4891. And you know what that spells? That spells DUI guy 1. Because we're doing criminal law.
Repeat that again. 1-866 DUI got 1.
Guy 1, yeah. 384-4891.
Nice. Also, are you available for constitutional law talks or discussions with groups?
Yeah, absolutely, man. We share the good news, right?
That'll be awesome. Well, Albert, man, thanks for being a friend for 20 years. Thanks for being a rock for me, lending me legal insight and advice, and also lending me advice on how to run a firm successfully and run a business and taking care of the essential things you needed to run a firm. Number 1 was the knowledge, which we acquired through law school. 2 is the equipment. And 3 is winning the clients to get the work done. So I appreciate that. Don't you have a book on starting a law firm too?
No.
Okay.
I think Feinberg he wrote basically the Bible.
Right.
On starting a law practice.
That's what it is. You told me about Feinberg's book, and I
yeah. And yeah, Sean, let me just say, you're a really special person. You are really super smart. You have a good heart. You're a great communicator. And I've always enjoyed talking with you about law or anything like that. So congratulations on this podcast. You're doing a fantastic job. I'm really happy for you.
Hey, thanks, man. And hopefully your Clippers can win one this year.
Yeah, we got close.
And maybe the Angels can bounce back. But as far as us Laker and Dodgers fans,
that's cool.
Nice.
Good year for you, huh?
Yeah, good year for me. But thanks again. Hey, folks, reach out to Albert. If you need a lawyer and workers' comp, insurance defense, be sure to go to snworkcomp.com. Call Albert and his partner, and they'll get to work for you. Thanks a lot, Albert. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, my friend.
Thank you.
Take care.
Attorney knows best. Intelligent questions. Interesting